Hello everyone, welcome back to another week of art. Our goals today are I can explain what a constellation is and how it is used by different cultures, and I can explain what an oral story is and brainstorm ideas on how to create my own. This week we are going to combine the traditional idea of creating art with another method of creation, the art of storytelling. Today is focused on building ideas, understanding how storytelling is used as a creative way to explain the world around us. While listening to this video, I'd like you to make a list of the 3-2-1 method. 3 things you learned, 2 parts that were interesting, and 1 question you still have. Storytelling can be seen in every culture all throughout human history and even seen before we were able to create books of our own stories. There are also a few other names for oral storytelling or storytelling. It can also be known as folklore, mythology, songs and hymns, or just plain oral storytelling. Humans have used storytelling to pass down lessons and explanations even before we could write storybooks. Sometimes it was a catchy song that was passed down to tell the story of heroes. Sometimes it was the story told over a fire to explain why things happen in the world around us and to keep everyone safe. Regardless, each culture had these stories where they lived. Some places will be specifically talking about the Midwest of the United States, China, Hawaii, and the Greeks in the Mediterranean. Every social class had these stories, from hunters to farmers, to nobles to royalty. Humans create stories to pass on memories long after they're gone. What's so interesting is that many of these stories have similar themes, as well as similar sources. You see, even though many of these cultures would not meet one another for hundreds of years, they all used the night sky to tell different stories. Have you ever looked up at the night sky and seen the stars? In the city, they're not as visible, but you may be able to spot some of the stars that are larger than others. If you found a spot and looked at the stars and checked every night, you would notice some of the stars change as the year goes on. Those before us noticed this change as well and began using the stars to tell what time of year it was. They used the stars they could see to tell tales explaining why the seasons changed, how to find food, and sometimes just stories to pass the time. Now, I asked earlier if you had ever looked up at the stars. Now, another question. Have you ever looked up at the clouds and thought they looked like a recognizable shape? Like waves of an ocean, or an animal, like a horse, or even a face? Ancient cultures would do this, but they would do it with the stars in the night sky. If they could imagine a shape using the points of the stars connecting to one another, it would make it easier to remember and to look for in the following years. These images were called constellations. We know them as constellations because much of the English language is borrowed from Latin, which is a language based in Italy. Constellations can be broken down into 3 parts: con, meaning together, stella, meaning star, and shun, which is a suffix meaning the condition it is in. This makes the definition of constellation stars together. Most stories used in myth and folklore have to do with the supernatural explanations for why the world works the way it does. More often than not, there is a god or a demigod used to explain why these events are happening. In Greek culture, the main character in these tales was Hercules, who went on many adventures. In Polynesian culture, Maui is a popular character to explain how the land was made, as well as why the days are longer or shorter. An example of a star that's a part of multiple constellations across multiple cultures is the star Betelgeuse, which is the brightest star in our sky. The constellations using the star are often seen in the winter in the northern hemisphere, which is America, Europe, and Asia, and so some of the stories reflect that season. The Greek constellation using the star is known as Orion. Orion is a Greek mythological figure who was a famous hunter, so famous in fact that the gods immortalized him in the stars to be told for centuries to come. Betelgeuse is also used in the Chinese constellation known as Shen, or the 3 stars, which also is the depiction of a hunter. The Ojibwe constellation using Betelgeuse is known as the Winter Maker, which is a story only told in the winter of what to do when the Winter Maker comes and how to make sure you have all your food and supplies ready for the long winter. The South African myth for a cluster of stars next to Betelgeuse is known as the Digging Stars. They are called the Digging Stars because this is the time when it was to plant crops for food. So they used these stars to remember and know when it was time to plant. Remember, South Africa is in the lower half of the earth, so when it is cold in the north, it's hot in the south. And when it's hot, it's the perfect time to plant your crops. Another example of a Greek constellation is Scorpius. The time this constellation is most visible is in the summer in the northern hemisphere. This constellation is also in Polynesian mythology, and it's known as the sheep's fishing line. The story of this constellation is related to the demigod Maui and his fishing hook, which he used to pull the islands from the sea and grab the sun, slowing it down to create longer days in the summer. The Greeks also had a myth about the sun, and it was the god Helios who would carry the sun in his golden chariot across the sky every day. The stories that went along with constellations had many purposes depending on the cultures they were created in. They were starting points for life lessons, when to grow food and when to stay inside warm and safe. They were used to explain why seasons change, or why the sun lasted longer at certain points of the year. They were even used to just be stories of grand adventures of the heroes of old. That's all for this video. Remember, for this response, I need you to tell me 3 things you learned, 2 things that were interesting, and 1 thing you're still confused about. In the next video, we will be discussing what we are going to do with myths and constellations this week in art class, including starting on brainstorming ideas.